Work is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back to this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you liked that segment on Anthony Richardson because he truly is going to be an anomaly of a fantasy quarterback because not many people know what to do with him or how to handle him. But coming up next, we switch teams in the division. We go from the Colts to the Texans, where an exciting young wide receiver is potentially emerging to assume the mantle of one of the best wide receivers in the league. I'm being completely serious. I saw what this kid could do. He was also on my fantasy team along with Jalen Waddle last year. So that duo makes quite the tandem for me. And that young man is Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. Now, the Houston Texans will always be a team that's going to be closely scrutinized, not just because of C.J. Stroud, but because of these receivers. Because no one expected the meteoric rise of these young Texans receivers. No one thought they would be among one of the best wide receiver rooms in the league, and yet here I am talking to you about a guy probably many of you might not have heard of before last season as one of the best wide receivers in this league. And I truly will stand by this statement until I'm in my grave, because looking at Nico Collins' season last year, it's up there with some of the better wide receivers in this league. And I truly think that this segment will show you guys what I mean about Nico Collins. So let's jump right into his fantasy stats. Throughout his short career, he's accumulated 291.1 fantasy points. Last year, obviously, was the year for him in terms of fantasy, with 180.4 fantasy points. He was 12th in targets per route run, 2nd in yards per route run, 7th in receiving yards, 5th in first downs per route run. That's pretty impressive if I do say so myself. That's right on the precipice of being at the very least, a wide receiver 7 to 8, if not a wide receiver 6 to 5. And so, I really think that out of all those Texans wide receivers, Nico Collins is going to be the guy for C.J. Stroud. And fantasy odds, projecting him with around wide receiver 1, maybe even wide receiver 1A numbers. 1,144 yards, 8 TDs, for a total of 163.7 fantasy points is what the fantasy odds have him at right now. And I would say that's just about the perfect number for Nico Collins, because I don't necessarily think he has to prove himself. I don't necessarily think he's going to be a flashy guy in this league. He's just going to be a solid, put his head down, go out there and win football games for you kind of wide receiver. And that's definitely how the Houston Texans culture is centered towards. It's centered around, we're going to be a hard-nosed, physical, in-your-face team. We have a swaggering young quarterback who is also someone who can lead us to the promised land. We have a skill position group that's ever evolving, headlined by a guy who's certainly looking to be a fantastic wide receiver in this league. And we have a head coach who certainly knows no wrong so far and thus far in this Houston Texans system. And so I really think the sky's the limit for any Houston Texan in terms of fantasy and in the AFC South. Now, here's where I think Nico Collins might, and a big emphasis on might, fall flat. I certainly feel as if next year the Houston Texans are going to be far more, not cautious with how they play and handle things with C.J. Stroud, but a little bit more wary of where he can pick and choose his moments, because you don't want a good thing to stop going. You don't want the train to fall off the tracks. They want to keep C.J. Stroud steady, and part of that stems from being a bit more conservative. And I think that I kind of counteracted this point when I was talking about C.J. Stroud and his player profile, where I said that on early downs, because they know he can throw the football, they might want to get him going early. But I kind of feel like a standard and precedent has to be set where C.J. Stroud can feel comfortable playing both styles of football. the Texans definitely have a very interesting running back room where Dameon Pierce certainly is in that workhorse running back mold. And he still can produce 1,000 yards for you. And that's great. But in order for CJ Stroud to feel comfortable not just throwing the football and staying within the structure of the game plan, Dameon Pierce, I certainly feel like, is going to have to be more of that workhorse mode and not the 1,000-yard guy. Thus, by allowing CJ Stroud to kind of say, okay, I'm going to trust my arm. Because if Dameon Pierce only gets you about 3 to 4 yards per carry, you're looking at some second and longer, third and manageable situations where CJ Stroud can really let the ball fly. And thus, that's where I kind of feel where the muddleness of the Texans' offense stems from. The second and third down plays. Because let's say Nico Collins remains the wide receiver 1. And let's say Tank Dell is the wide receiver 2. CJ Stroud, probably on the second down, is going to look for Nico Collins first. And then on the third down, that's where I think he's going to look for Tank Dell. Because the important thing to remember here is that Nico Collins, like I said, is going to be an all-around receiver. Tank Dell certainly feels like a certain down receiver or a red zone receiver because he's a smaller receiver. He's more of a savvy, intelligent receiver in the red zone especially, who is more known for his yards after the catch and his speed than Nico Collins is. Nico Collins is going to run the route to get open, not run past someone, if you catch my drift. And so, looking at Nico Collins as a wide receiver 1 is a very, very important kind of decision you have to make because I really like him on early downs. But like I said, what remains to be seen if what the Texans decide to do on early downs. Do they stick with Dameon Pierce, getting you 3 to 4 yards per first down, or do they let CJ Stroud throw the football early and often, thus allowing Nico Collins to potentially get more targets? And I think that both can be very true of what we see early on. Both can define the Texans season and how Nico Collins plays. And so, I'm not non-committal on Nico Collins potentially regressing to the mean, but there are ways he can. However, the reason why I'm so high on him is because of the fact that CJ Stroud likes players who run routes. And Nico Collins does that to a T. CJ Stroud wants someone who's just as smart and connected to the game as him. And Nico Collins is that. In the red zone, it could get a bit different. In the red zone, CJ Stroud might want someone to just go past a guy and he can air out a fade to him. But in the open field, when you're looking to kind of outwit a defense, keep them on edge, Nico Collins looks to be that guy. And if I were someone in a fantasy draft, say 4 out of 5 players who I would consider wide receiver 1 are gone, and the players left at the table are of Nico Collins, Jalen Waddles, DJ Moore's caliber, and I'm looking at those 3 guys as my wide receiver 1s or 2s, or even a flex option, Nico Collins certainly seems like the most appealing. Mainly due to the fact that A, he's not a prototypical wide receiver 1 because there really is no true wide receiver 1, in my humble opinion, on the Houston Texans. And B, he still gives you 20 to 25 fantasy points per game. There was one stretch where I remember Nico Collins simply doing no wrong in fantasy, where he had consistent 200-yard games. And that's saying something as to what this kid can be. Right now, I don't think that's sustainable for what the Houston Texans are right now, because they have overachieved. They've already gone to the playoffs before a lot of people thought they would. And so, this definitely could look like a very silly segment come the start of the year. I'm willing to err on the side of caution, however, and say that don't overthink picking Nico Collins, rather. I'm thinking about soccer altogether. But here's what I will say. If it was down to 4 or 5 receivers in the mid-rounds of a fantasy draft, and one of their names is Nico Collins, I'm immediately scooping him up. And that should say something about his caliber. That should just about do it for this segment of today's show. Coming up next, we switch to another quarterback who's definitely kind of in that Matthew Stafford mold. He played on the same team as him, so he's definitely going to be someone who's going to be very interesting to dive into. But we will be right back with that segment of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast right after the break.